News. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to major developments in the landmark lawsuit filed by a group of Ecuadorian farmers and fishermen against Chevron, the world's third largest oil company. In 2011, an Ecuadorian court found Chevron liable for nearly 3 decades of soil and water pollution near oil wells and said it had ruined the health and livelihoods of people living in nearby areas of the Amazon rainforest. Since then, the victims have been trying to collect some $18 billion in environmental damages.
But Chevron has vowed never to comply with the judgment. In a case now before a federal court in New York, Chevron argues the main American lawyer in the case, Steve Donziger, won the verdict after he engaged in judicial coercion, fabrication of evidence, and bribery. The court's expected to rule in the coming months. Han Chan, working with the victims, spoke as Ecuadorian villagers and their supporters rallied across from the courthouse in New York in October.
Nearly every single person who's been named as a defendant in Chevron's retaliatory RICO suit has loved ones, has family members who've died, who've contracted cancer, who've suffered from birth defects and other oil-related illness due to Chevron's contamination. This lawsuit essentially rubs salt in their wounds.
Well, as victims of Chevron fight this case in the United States, they've also tried to move forward on collecting damages from the company in Canada. Now the courts there have given the green light for the rainforest residents to attempt to seize Chevron's Canadian assets.
This week, a panel of judges noted a Chevron spokesman had previously said, quote, "We're going to fight this until hell freezes over, and then we'll fight it out on the ice." In response, the judges wrote, quote, "After all these years, the Ecuadorian plaintiffs deserve to have recognition and enforcement of the Ecuadorian judgment heard on the merits in an appropriate jurisdiction. At this juncture, Ontario is that jurisdiction." Well, for more, we go to Paul Barrett, assistant managing editor and senior writer at Bloomberg Businessweek. He's been following all this closely, and his book about the Chevron oil pollution case in Ecuador is due out next year. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Paul. Talk about the significance of this decision.
The importance of the decision in Canada is that for the first time, the Ecuadorian plaintiffs will be able to go before the judiciary of a third country, not Ecuador, not the United States, and say, we have a legitimate judgment in Ecuador, multiple billions of dollars, and we believe it should be enforced. And we want you, the judiciary of Canada, to respect the judiciary of Ecuador and allow us to literally seize the operations of Chevron in this country.
What assets could be seized?
Well, you're talking about refineries, Chevron's ownership in operations, for example, in Western Canada in the tar sands area, and bank accounts, and any assets that could then be sold off and offset against this multi-billion-dollar verdict in Ecuador.
Now, the verdict in Ecuador has gone up the entire chain of the court system in that country,
sure.
Right? What is, in essence, the main claims of Chevron about that verdict in particular?
Right. Well, that's, of course, Juan, the other side of the story here, because Chevron says that while there may be victims of oil pollution in Ecuador, and in fact, if you go down there and have your eyes open, you can see there is a tremendous problem of contamination. Chevron says those are not our problem. This is not something that can be laid at our doorstep. And in fact, the 2011 judgment against Chevron, the company says, was the product of corruption, that you had outside American lawyers cooperating with Ecuadorian lawyers and corrupt Ecuadorian judges to put together what amounts to a sham. And that's where we have the conflict, and that's the argument you're going to hear in the Canadian courts, because while the Canadians have said we will hear this argument, they have not said we're going to rule for the Ecuadorians. They've said we're going to give you an opportunity to make your argument, and Chevron's argument on the other side is this is all a sham.
Paul Barrett, quickly give us the history of Chevron
Sure.
in Ecuador, because it didn't start as Chevron.
Absolutely not. The history really begins with Texaco in the 1960s in Ecuador, invited into the country by the then military government of Ecuador to exploit the oil reserves in the rainforest east of the Andes. And Texaco was there for 25-odd years. Texaco did what it was asked to do. This was not some type of, by dark of night, American oil company comes in and takes all the profits out. This was done in close cooperation with the Ecuadorian government. The big problem was that Texaco left a big mess on the ground. Waste oil pools, pollution. They sprayed waste oil on the roads to keep dust down. And it looks like, if you've been down there, what you might imagine the Gulf Coast of the United States looked like in the 1920s, except with rural Ecuadorian poverty hard up against the oil operations. 2001, Chevron takes over Texaco and inherits its legal problems, its liabilities. A lawsuit has been filed in 1993 on behalf of the residents here in New York. That lawsuit was actually dismissed by the American courts on the assumption that the proper place for it to be played out was in Ecuador. The lawsuit was restarted in Ecuador in 2003, and the result of that lawsuit, some 8 years later, was this huge victory for the Ecuadorian plaintiffs. And it was to the tune of? Well, initially it was $18 billion plus. In upholding the verdict, as Juan correctly said, the top court in Ecuador actually said the liability is legitimate, Chevron must pay, but they cut the verdict in half. So at this point, the liability at this moment is $9.5 billion.
And in terms of the likelihood of the court case that Chevron is pursuing here in the United States,
yes.
Can you talk about that and the likelihood
Absolutely.
of success in that? This
is Chevron's counterpunch. Chevron, the plaintiffs landed a big blow in Ecuador, and Chevron said, we lost in Ecuador. We're not going to pay, but we lost. We're going to take you back to the United States, where all of this started, and we're going to prove that the people on the other side are akin to gangsters. They used the U.S. anti-racketeering law enacted in 1970 to deal with the mafia.
So it's a RICO suit.
It's a RICO suit, exactly. And we are going to show that what you called a lawsuit was actually a conspiracy, a protection racket, a shakedown of the company. And they put on evidence for 6 weeks. I was actually there almost every day of this trial, as were all kinds of much more famous people like Sting and his wife Trudy Styler and others. This is now with a federal judge here in New York, and we're eagerly awaiting his ruling, which could come as early as January. And he's going to say either Chevron is correct or Chevron is incorrect, and I think all the smart money is on his finding for Chevron. And I think Chevron is going to walk away from this trial with a judgment from a U.S. court that says that Steve Donziger and his clients were actually basically akin to criminals who shook down this big American company.
You've also been following BP.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you can talk about what's happening in the legal cases with BP and what BP is doing, because it seems to be following a certain pattern.
There is a pattern here throughout the oil industry, but it even goes broader than that. It's throughout corporate America. A strategy is emerging on the part of major corporations whereby when they're hit with big liability in court, they turn not so much to the merits of the case, but to the lawyers who have brought the case, and they try to ruin the lawyer. Now, the companies would say we're doing this because the lawyers are all thieves and crooks. The plaintiff's lawyers would say otherwise. But in the BP case, just this last week, BP has filed a massive fraud case against a plaintiff's lawyer in Texas named Michael Watts, who is one of the most powerful and influential mass tort lawyers in this country, a big supporter, as it happens, of President Obama, one of his main financiers. And Watts had filed tens of thousands of claims against BP in connection with the 2010 Gulf of Mexico oil spill. That's all being fought out in the courts, but meanwhile, BP has said Watts is a fraud, and more than half of his 40,000 claims, those people don't even exist.
Well, they seem to have, at least on the face of it, some pretty good evidence that he submitted Social Security numbers for people whose names were not the same names as the Social Security numbers that they represented, and that many of them were dead. And
well, as with the Chevron case, wherever your loyalties are on the underlying merits, oil on the ground, oil in the water, as with the Chevron case, the companies have come up with very troubling evidence of plaintiffs' lawyers cutting corners and basically using an ends justify the means approach to trying to hold the oil companies accountable. I mean, I think we would all agree that not that not all ends justify any means. If you're in a court of law, the evidence has to be real evidence. The plaintiffs have to be real people.
Oh, I wanted to go back to the lawyer in the case in Ecuador.
Yeah.
There have been also some problems between him and some of his clients as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Since then.
This is a man who, as he's proceeded through this case, has had fallings out with most of his allies and some of his clients. So there are other groups of Ecuadorians who have claimed that he doesn't represent their interests, and they've actually filed their own lawsuit against him. That's pending here in New York. And meanwhile, some of his scientific advisors have disavowed their own work on his behalf. So this is a very troubling and confused situation.
I wanted to stay with Ecuador, the Chevron case. I recently interviewed the Ecuadorian Foreign Minister, Ricardo Patino, when he was here in New York, and asked him about the pollution that Chevron Texaco left behind.
President Rafael Correa, a few days ago, went to an area where Chevron Texaco was operating, and the president put his hands in the toxic waste pits that Chevron Texaco left and raised his oil-stained hand up to show the world how Chevron Texaco has destroyed the Ecuadorian Amazon and did not use the cleanup methodologies that were available at the time to mitigate or even avoid environmental damages.
You argue that Chevron Texaco has not cleaned up the Amazon, that it polluted. Why hasn't the Ecuadorian government done more to clean it up over these decades that Chevron Texaco is gone? Wasn't Texaco a subcontractor for the Ecuador, Petroecuador?
The governments prior to the current government did not take measures to clean up Texaco's mess. At one point, officials of Ecopetrol had issued a document saying that Texaco had in fact cleaned up, but we know that this isn't the case. That is why Ecuador has now begun to clean up the damage. But now we have to put that on hold, because otherwise the evidence of their pollution will no longer exist. So the proof could be disappear if we continue with the cleanup.
That's Ecuadorian Foreign Minister Ricardo Patino. If you could respond to that, and also you had an exclusive interview with the Ecuadorian ambassador to the United States.
Yes. Well, I mean, you asked the Ecuadorian official, one of the most important questions, which is, what's the priority here? Is the priority to actually clean up the oil, which, after all, was being drilled and produced on behalf of your country, not on behalf of another country? The vast majority of the revenue generated from all of that activity by Texaco stayed in Ecuador, and some of it was put to very good use, building roads, electrifying small towns, and so forth. And I don't think the government of Ecuador really has a good answer, and I think you saw that demonstrated there, whereas, yes, someone else should have done it earlier, and now we've started to do it, but now we've stopped doing it because of evidence. Well, look, if you've got poor people who are living up to their ankles in oil, you clean up the oil and you figure out the legalities and the liabilities later. You don't put it all on hold. And I think in an interesting way, the ambassador to the United States took another small step forward, and she said in a more positive way, she actually said, I think we should be cleaning up the oil, and the lawyers are telling us not to, and we've got to figure out a political compromise. We've got to figure out a way to just get this done. And I thought that was actually a heartening statement by her.
Paul Bauer, I want to thank you for being with us, and we're going to link to your articles, assistant managing editor and senior writer at Bloomberg Businessweek. His latest book is called Glock, The Rise of America's Gun. His book about the Chevron oil pollution case in Ecuador is due out next year. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily, independent, global grassroots news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org today. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.